don't hear music in my head. I hear music when it's actually being sung or being produced on instruments. I write music in order to hear it. I couldn't really imagine that it would be as beautiful as I think it is.
In Kyoto, Japan, there's a meditative rock garden called Ryoanji, which inspired John Cage to create the same peaceful landscape in this work, which he named after the garden. In Kyoto, the monks of the Zen temple rake the sand of the garden every day in the same direction. In Cage's music, the percussion accompaniment represents that raked sand, the same sound occurring over and over again. Cage has said that everything we do is music. He is the composer who taught us to attune our ears to environmental sounds. And that chance elements can become part of the artistic whole. During this performance, an ant jumped onto my score and began crawling around. So I just sang him wherever he went. In fact, the audience itself became sound makers, and thus part of the performance.
John Cage believed in breaking down barriers. Barriers between sound and silence. Barriers between musical sounds and noise. And barriers between performer and audience. Now the task of the performer in the John Cage aria is to find 10 colors in his or her voice that will match the 10 colors in the score. There are actually 9 colors plus a dotted black line.
but the notion of response is there and seems to me basic to church and folk music.
The chime of the bell beckons us into sacred time. Welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston, a congregation that welcomes you no matter who you are or who you love, no matter how you practice spirituality, because we know we need not think alike to love alike. We extend a heartfelt and inclusive welcome to join us in meaningful worship and service to the world. We greet all of you who are joining us this morning, whether here in our sanctuary or with us online. Así como el creciente número de participantes bilingües que nos acompañan desde sus hogares. We encourage you to make use of the order of service, either a paper copy or by scanning the QR code on the back of the pew card. Note that the text for the responses throughout the services are printed on the pew card. This morning's service will be a little bit unusual. It's devoted to an exploration of the spirituality of the philosopher and composer John Cage. Like the longtime former minister of this congregation, the Reverend Bob Shibley, Cage was profoundly influenced by Zen Buddhism. Like Bob, he was influential in introducing that tradition to countless people who might not have otherwise come across it. Partially through his Buddhist practice, Cage came to believe that each sound, each object we encounter in ordinary life is an opportunity to experience beauty. This led him to shift his understanding of what constitutes music and how music is composed in an effort to prompt others to reimagine music and beauty as well. Having said that, I invite you to open yourself to the experience of his piece, Radio Music. With the hiss of the radio, we are reminded that we are born into a world of sounds. There is no such thing as silence. The human heart beats. The mind hums. Even the body is never still, always generating sound. There is no such thing as silence. Even if we do not hear, sound touches us. For sound waves are a physicality, the ripple of matter moving from crest to trough to crest again. They caress our skin. There is no such thing as silence. Sound connects us. Through the whispers of lovers, the squeal of children, the racket of dogs, the clatter of cans, breaking dishes and torn paper, all that surrounds us, there is no such thing as silence. Let us open ourselves then to the sound of the world, its very matter caressing us, finding in each voice, each touch of a sound wave, each rattle and bang, a new murmur, a new experience. There is no such thing as silence. Come, friends, let us worship together.
Celebremos combatiendo nuestras vidas, encendiendo esta luz.
Please join with me in reading our church covenant on the back side of your order of service. Love is the spirit of our congregation. Service is our prayer, to dwell together in peace, to seek truth in love, and to encourage one another. Thus do we covenant.
Litany for the Whale is a meditative composition. The effect is very similar to Gregorian chant. The two singers alternate singing just 5 pitches, each one assigned to a letter in the word whale. In 1989, the mezzo Mary Feinsinger and I recorded the work for the Canadian film company Rhombus Media, from which this video of swimming whales was taken.
So I wanted to take this opportunity to share a little bit about some of the piano music you'll be hearing in this service. So as you know, Cage was a pioneering avant-garde composer, and one of the concept he pioneered for the piano was the idea of the prepared piano. The reason this all came about was because he was working as an accompanist for a dance class when he lived in Seattle. And he was really frustrated by the fact that he couldn't bring a percussion ensemble on stage with him while he was playing. And as you know, the piano typically is not used as a very percussive instrument if you just play on the keys. And so he started experimenting with putting everyday items like bolts and screws in between the strings of the piano to create a slightly different sound. And you know, the pieces you'll hear today have very limited preparation, just a few screws in between the strings. You'll see me preparing the piano as well later. But as he went on and explored this concept and developed it further, he got really complex in terms of what items he put inside the piano, to the point of modifying almost every single note so that the piece would sound completely different once all those items were inside. So you will hear two pieces like that later, but for now, I wanted to see if there are any young people. I see a couple here, and I wanted to invite you up for this piece I'm about to play on this lovely instrument right here. So as you can all see, this is a toy piano, much smaller than its big sister up there on stage that I usually play. So at the time Cage wrote this piece, which was in 1948, he had become really, really sick and tired of how complex piano music had gotten. I mean, there's a lot of notes, there's 88 keys on that piano, and composers were constantly trying to push the boundaries of how complex and difficult they could make music for people like me to play. And so Cage really liked how few keys there were on this piano. Do you want to come over and count and see how many there are? So we have only 15 keys on this little piano. And Cage actually wrote a whole suite to be played on this little piano, and he was the first person to do this, to compose for toy piano. So he was restraining himself both in terms of the number of keys that he had, but also in terms of the dynamics. And what's kind of ironic is that this has a very limited dynamic range, but in the music, he writes in everything from extremely soft to extremely loud, none of which can be produced on this. So there's also a level of irony to it. So you're welcome to sit next to me while I play this little piece, if you guys want to come up too. And now I think we can use this very expressive instrument to sing the young people on their way.
Enter with me into the space that some call prayer and others name meditation. Open yourself to the wonders and mysteries of the world. Open yourself to compassion and empathy. Take one breath. Take another. Center yourself. This morning, I invite you to be present with your body, the rhythm of your heart, the steady draw of your breath, the pulse of your nervous system. I invite you to be present with all that is around you, the warmth of your neighbor, the texture of your pew, the light that shines green through trees, the Sunday morning sounds outside of the sanctuary windows. I invite you to be present with those things that comprise our lives, the moments of joy, frustration, despair, hope, love, and deep connection to all that we are. And now, seek the blessing of what beauty can be found in these things. That it may be so, I invite the congregation to say Amen. We pause now to lift up that which sits heavy and light upon our hearts. We lift up Thorpe Butler and Rita Saylor. Thorpe's 23-year-old great-grandniece, Kate Butler, was killed last autumn by a drunk driver in Rome. It's only now been possible to hold a memorial service for her. And so we hold the entire family in our hearts as they mourn and process this tragedy. We also lift up Norma Acker, who has been hospitalized and has asked for prayers. As we do, we hold in our hearts Jacqueline M. Willis Johnson, Charles Johnson's wife. She's been released from the hospital and is resting at home. She and Charles welcome prayers for a sunny healing process. We also hold in our hearts Craig Ottinger, who had a surgery on Wednesday, and Doug Carlisle, who is back in the hospital. We send them wishes for peace and healing. We now turn to a practice inspired by African, indigenous, and neo-pagan traditions. We say aloud or bring to mind those we wish to hold in the loving embrace of this community. In this great cloud of witness and memory, amid this beloved community, we hear these names and hold them in our hearts. Let us also extend our empathy to all of the suffering and joy amid and among our community that we do not know. Pause in awe and wonder of the beauty, diversity, and mystery that is life. In the spirit of love, in the spirit of hope, and in the spirit of compassion, I invite you into a special silent time of meditation, reflection, or prayer. A contemplation of John Cage's musing on the presence, absence, and nature of music. 4 minutes and 33 seconds.
Each week, our morning offering is shared with an organization that shares our Unitarian Universalist values and through which we may live out our principles in the world. It is our tradition that on a Sunday near March 8th, the International Women's Day, the offering is shared with the International Convocation of Unitarian Universalist Women, also known as the IWC, or the International Women's Convocation. This is a nonprofit organization that advances equity for women and is worldwide through leadership development, empowerment, and awareness programs, advocacy, and resources. This morning, to tell us more about IWC is Zofia Stranchnicki, the Executive Director of the International Convocation of Unitarian Universalist Women. Ms. Zofia?
Good morning, or as we Transylvanian Hungarians would greet each other, Isten áldjon. As Connie mentioned, the International Convocation of Unitarian Universalist Women, or short IWC, is an NGO in special consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, focusing on global women's rights and empowerment. IWC partners with Unitarian or Unitarian Universalist women's groups and other grassroots organizations and NGOs to advance equity for women and girls worldwide through leadership development, awareness programs, advocacy, and resources. Some of our recent programs include support for indigenous Guatemalan communities to create women's food forests, support for asylum-seeking women and their families in the US, COVID relief, including specific support for women and girls in India, Western Kenya, and Romania, violence awareness and prevention programs in UU communities in Hungary, India, the Philippines, and Romania, a leadership development program including skills training for creating small businesses in Bolivia, and humanitarian relief for families fleeing war in Ukraine, overwhelmingly women and children, including a kindergarten and an elementary class led by Ukrainian teachers for refugee children in my hometown, Kolozsvár, Cluj, as well as regular aid shipments to Ukraine. We have just launched a project in collaboration with Sueños Sin Fronteras de Texas, a Latinx, women of color-led advocacy collective in San Antonio, Texas, to offer educational workshops for low-income, immigrant, Black, Indigenous, and people of color to enhance self-advocacy and community organizing. Around the world today, a growing backlash against women's rights threatens well-established freedoms and protections. Less than a decade away from the ambitious goals of the 2030 UN Agenda for Sustainable Development, the world is not on track to achieve gender equality. In fact, on Monday, in a speech at the opening of the 67th session of the UN Commission on the Status of Women, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that progress won over decades is vanishing before our eyes, and the world, believe it or not, is 300 years away from gender equality. Now, I don't think anyone in this room wants to wait that long. Together, we can make the 21st century the century of women's equality. So I'm asking all of you to commit. Please support IWC as it turns the clock forward on women's rights and strives to make gender equality a reality in this century. Thank you for your generous donations.
Those of you in our sanctuary will find the instructions for text giving on the order of service, and those watching in live stream will see the instructions on your screen. Our regular Sunday morning offering collection invites us to weave a tapestry of love and action. We ask you to give generously. The offering shall now be gratefully received.
Sonicos is a series of 9 short songs, of which I'll sing 3. The texts are based upon words in the book of Genesis, written as mesostics. Now, mesostics are the capital letters, when read vertically, spell, in this case, sonnerie, S-O-N-N-E-R-I-E-S, which is French because it came from Eric Satie's Sonnerie de la Rose. There are 9 letters in sonnerie and 9 songs in the piece. You can see the capital letters, right? Yeah, S-O-N, and the next screen, you'll find it. We performed Sonicus at Barnard College in 1985 with Cage himself reading from his work, The First Meeting of the Satie Society. I entered and exited 9 times, changing costumes for each song, which I'm not going to do today.
Please join with me in the words to dedicate our offering found on your laminated pew card. To the work of this church, which is weaving a tapestry of love and action, we dedicate our lives, and these are offerings.
story comes from a four-movement work that Cage composed in 1940 called Living Room Music. Performers transform household objects like sofas and chairs and windowsills, etc., into percussion instruments. Now, Story is the second movement, a speech quartet based upon Gertrude Stein's 1938 poem, The World is Round. Once upon a time, a once upon a time, a once upon a time, a time, a time, a once upon a time, once upon a time, once upon a time, a once upon a time, a time, once upon a time, upon a time, upon a time, a time upon a time, upon a time, once, the world was round. And it, and you could go on it. You could go, and you could go on it, and you could go on it. You could go and you, and it, and you and it. You could go and you could go on it, and round, round. You could go on round, and round, round. You could go on round, and you could go on around and around and around, 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 around and around. Once upon a time, a once upon a time, a time upon a once upon a time, upon a time, time upon a time, round, 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 Once upon a time, the world was round and round, and round, 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 round. The world was round. You could go around and around and around, around and around, around and around, round.
I suspect that there's at least a segment of you who have come to the conclusion that this is a rather strange service. Avant-garde music, even if it's a few decades old, is not part of our regular Sunday morning routine. Music for religious services is supposed to be beautiful or energizing, not pushing the definition of what is music itself, or, let's face it, confusing the listener. So, at the outset, I want to share a little bit about why and how this service came to be. I've long been inspired by John Cage's art, music, and philosophy. I was introduced to it in my early 20s when I was part of the emerging techno scene in Detroit. It was a heady time of late-night parties, DJs who performed complicated tricks on turntables. I had a friend, Claude Young, who used to actually create a contraption that allowed him to play a record upside down and backwards, and long hours of dancing. After all of that, we would sometimes find ourselves in intense conversations about the origins and future of electronic music. Names of composers would be thrown around in abandon. Philip Glass, Brian Eno, Laurie Anderson, Sun Ra, and Wendy Carlos might all make an appearance in the conversation. Someone would probably mention that the seminal Detroit artist Derek May had a vision for the future of music, which he described as a complete mistake, like George Clinton and Kraftwerk stuck in an elevator together with only a synthesizer between them. And then, almost inevitably, Cage would enter the conversation. A composer, artist, philosopher, and devotee of Zen Buddhism, he was active from the late 1930s until the late 1980s. He often wrote work to accompany dance music, or dance performances, particularly those choreographed by his longtime partner, Merce Cunningham. It was Cage, someone might mention, who in 1939, with his piece Imaginary Landscape No. 1, first used a turntable in a musical performance. It was Cage, someone else might interject, whose use of tape recorders and radios in compositions prefigured the use of samplers and sampling in hip-hop and house music. It was Cage. Now, it's actually important to note, I think, that a lot of the people involved in these conversations were self-taught. They had not gone to the music conservatory or college or perhaps even graduated from high school. They'd cobbled together enough money to get 2 turntables and a microphone, a used drum machine, and they were passionate about playing dance music in the sort of places that I'm probably not supposed to talk about in the pulpit. So, Cage, he was this thread in our lives, and as I got a bit older, I went to seminary to study with the Unitarian Universalist theologian Tan Deika, who some of you know and appreciate, who preached from this pulpit about a decade back and worked with the congregation at the time to develop a small group ministry. She was deeply influenced by Cage. His music and philosophy helped her to articulate a theology that moved so many of you and so many other Unitarian Universalists. It assisted her in understanding the way to spiritual awareness. Against those who lift up reason as the all-important center of our tradition, her studies of Cage helped her place the experience of the connection of all that is, which he describes as the luminous darkness of feelings enveloped by infinite light, at the heart of both religion in general and Unitarian Universalism in particular. Inspired by all of this, I offered a service devoted to Cage and his music a bit more than a decade ago when I was the minister of the Unitarian Universalist Society of Cleveland in Ohio. I found it to be a meaningful and moving experience with that congregation, and I had hoped to have sometime the opportunity to offer it to another community that I served. So imagine my delight when, about a year ago, Dr. Isabel Gantz came into our sanctuary. She was the director of music here in the early 1970s. Dr. Rock had invited her to be part of our spring music concert. She sang spring music festival. She sang some songs in Yiddish, and I was moved by that because as a child, my grandmother and great aunts used to speak to me in that language, and I had not heard it since they died. After her performance, we struck up a conversation, which turned into several conversations, and after a little while, I learned that Isabel had actually been one of John Cage's major collaborators in the 1980s. Here, I realized, was an opportunity too good to pass up, an exploration of Cage's art and music with one of his longtime collaborators. It was an opportunity to experience music and art through his eyes and see the beauty of the world a little differently and a little more spiritually. I want to turn now to the piece that was performed during the meditation sequence, 4 minutes and 33 seconds. Dr. Rock conducted our orchestra as they performed 3 movements with no notes, no melody, and, well, nothing. But this nothing is the center of the piece. It's the very presence of nothing that makes 4 minutes and 33 seconds one of the most influential pieces of music of the 20th century. Its premise is that everything that occurs during the piece is part of the piece. Each cough, each uncomfortable shift in the pew, reluctant sigh, shuffle of the order of service, bird sound, traffic noise, or perhaps incredulous murmur is music. 4 minutes and 33 seconds can, like the samples that followed it decades later, be understood as expanding the definition of music. Cage arrived at the piece after he set out to experience absolute silence. In the early 1950s, he was invited to use an anechoic chamber. That's a chamber that deploys a variety of different techniques to try to create this experience of absolute silence. Inside of it, there is supposed to be no rattle of a passing truck, no whisper of the wind, no ring of a telephone, just nothing. But instead of pure silence, Cage discovered 2 sounds in the chamber, a high-pitched whine and a low-pitched steady beat. Upon leaving the chamber, he told the engineer that the experience had been very interesting, but something was wrong with the chamber. He had heard 2 sounds. The engineer replied that the sounds that he had heard were those of his nervous system, that's the high-pitched whine, and the sound of his heartbeat, the low tones. From this experience, he discovered that hearing people are surrounded by sound at all times. Sounds, he wrote, occur whether intended or not. He realized that the traditional understanding of music was, in his words, an ideal situation, not a real one. When conceiving of a piece of music, a classical composer indicates through a score that the composition is supposed to be comprised of certain notes and be played on particular instruments. When the piece is performed, listeners hear something different than what the composer intended. They hear the planned notes, yes, but then there's also the ambient sound of the environment. This realization led Cage to seek to incorporate his environment and his body's unintended sound into music. 4 minutes and 33 seconds derives from Cage's realization that sound is a constant presence. The unintended sounds of our body and the environment are the only ones in the piece. Normally, ambient music and noise in the background becomes the canvas upon which the piece unfolds. It reverses the situation and turns ambient noise into music itself. Shifting our understanding of the nature of art and music is one of his central tasks. Such transformations of perception are spiritual work. They are why we are here, unusual as it might be, focused today's service on his avant-garde music. For profoundly influenced by Zen Buddhism, Cage saw art as having the function of awakening people to the life around them, a pursuit we regularly engage in together as a religious community. The Indian musician Gita Sabati, one of Cage's teachers, put the situation differently and told him, "The purpose of music is to sober and quiet the mind, making it susceptible to divine influences." Cage came to understand the divine in a sense that would be familiar to many Unitarian Universalists. It was for him all things that happened in creation. Such a perspective challenges us to find everyday life beautiful. Cage's music can provide a focus point through which we can reinterpret and re-engage with our environment. The actual sounds that are contained within his work might be unusual or fall outside of the realm of what you or I find pleasant to hear, and this is intentional. The work is meant to provoke us to reconsider the nature of music itself. He wrote, "People may leave my concerts thinking that they have heard noise, but then they will hear unexpected beauty in their everyday life." Unexpected beauty. Listening with Cage's music becomes not a matter of performance, but the result of an attitude. Sometimes I listen to the rattle of a washing machine, and clearing my perceptions, I can find it equal to other music. One is not more beautiful than the other. Each is a collection of sounds. The bow drawn across the tense strings of the violin, the water and clothes pushing against the machine's metal, the piano's hammer hitting the wires, and the jangling as dirt is shaken loose from fabric. The beauty of the sounds is not an inherent value. It's a value that we assign to them. If I choose or you choose, we can assign any sound the value of beautiful. Doing so offers us the possibility of taking greater pleasure from the world. It opens up experience. If, as Cage said, we got over our likes and dislikes, then we can fully engage with anything we encounter. Cage drew inspiration from the French artist Marcel Duchamp. Duchamp used his work to confront the conventional understandings of the nature of art. He is perhaps most famous for his ready-mades. These are a series of ordinary objects that Duchamp signed, gave titles to, and then placed in art galleries. They included a bicycle wheel, a snow shovel, and most controversially, a urinal labeled fountain. Duchamp hoped that when we see such familiar objects in the space of an art gallery, we will ask questions. Are these pieces art? What is art? Are we surrounded by art at all times? The Frenchman's work had the desired effect on Cage. During an interview, he shared the story about seeing some of the ready-mades. His work acted in such a way that my attention was drawn to the light switch on the wall, not away, but among the works of art. The light switch seemed to be as attention-deserving as anything else. Duchamp's work had a similar effect on me. One afternoon, soon after learning about it, a friend and I went to a grocery store in Ohio. There, in the rural store, we encountered a clear jug filled with a neon insecticide. The object was fascinating. It seemed beautiful and grotesque and problematic all at once. It had as much of a story as any other object. It was unique. It had been conceived by a human mind, built with human tools, and placed in front of me by human hands. Really, when I paused to consider it, I recognized that its presence before me required the actions of thousands, the chemists who had invented the formula, the workers in the factory who made it, the truck drivers who delivered it, and the store clerks who had placed it there. Under fluorescent light, it cast a pale green shadow. For Cage, such experiences were an opportunity to celebrate the uniqueness of everyday objects. During an interview with the scholar Joan Retlack, he reflected on a soup can in a supermarket. When you see a row of soup cans, you can notice rather quickly and easily that light falls on them differently. Each can is separate from every other can. They're only connected by the ideas in our head. But in reality, light falls on each one uniquely, so that it's at the center of the universe, or is the Buddha, you see. So it's worthy of honor. In response, Retlack replied, presumably the Buddha should be as useful as it can. Witty response aside, Cage's point was that viewed from a certain perspective, each object can trigger insight. Each object encountered is both unique and connected with everything else. Considering these facts can turn the mundane into the spiritual. Any sound we hear, any article we see or touch is an invitation into deeper connection. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh coined the word interbeing to describe the interrelation of all things. Han's name is likely familiar to some of you. Like Tandayaka, he once spoke from this pulpit. The time Bob Shibley spent with him at his Plum Village Monastery inspired him to organize the Houston Zen Center. And Bob often shared reflections with members of this congregation about his time with Han and how it helped him to develop a kind of mysticism that does not compromise my humanism. Cage has had a similar effect on me. Like Cage's approach to interconnection, Han's concept of interbeing is expressed in an exercise he invites us to engage in with an ordinary piece of paper. Look at the paper attentively and experience the revelation of interconnection. Your mind is here interpreting the paper. You cannot point to one thing that is not here, really. Time, space, the earth, the rain, the minerals in the soil, the sunshine, the clouds, the river, the heat, everything that has gone and occurred to make this sheet of paper possible is here within it, he states. Seeing the paper for what it is, it requires a certain perspective. And such perspectives are not easy to obtain. We usually focus on the utility of an object or simply ignore it, consigning it to the background. Cage's work is helpful because it is about engaging us to require a shift of perception. The paper, we see it in a new manner. The washing machine is heard for the first time, and the background sounds come into the foreground. It is possible to cultivate such a perspective through spiritual practice. Spiritual practice stills and sharpens the mind. It tunes the senses. It brings the background into the foreground. Spiritual practices vary by community and by individual. Some choose meditation or prayer as their spiritual practice. Others prefer journal writing, painting, regular exercise routines, or playing music. One of the things I appreciate about Unitarian Universalism is that our tradition recognizes that all spiritual practices serve the same function. They offer us a method to find our center, point to the possibility of insight, and have flashes of what Tandayaka has described as that momentary experience, too vast and fleeting for religious belief, so intimate that the distance between the inner and outer worlds collapses. For Cage, composition was a spiritual practice. It brought him into tune with nature. He believed personality is a flimsy thing on which to build art, and sought to transcend it through chance operations. These are methods of generating art independent of conscious intent. Chance operations range from simple actions like rolling dice to more complicated methods involving ancient Chinese divination tools such as the I Ching or computer programs. Cage developed a complex method for composition using the I Ching as a base. He would set some parameters for a piece, its length, the number of performers, or the number of instruments, and then flip coins to derive a series of I Ching divinations to determine the rest. This stripped intention from his work and led him to argue it mirrored the natural world. What we do without purpose. The highest purpose we have is to have no purpose at all. This puts us in accord with nature. Cage's understanding of the natural world reinforced his views about music and art. His primary engagement with the natural environment was through his passion for mushrooms, and he foraged for fungi every opportunity he got and even wrote a beautiful book on the subject. Those of you who know me well know that I have a similar spiritual practice of mushroom foraging, and a few of you have even gone on foraging trips with me. These are a chance operation. We commit to a particular technique or really a specific area, pay attention and see what the world brings. Sudden shifts of consciousness may occur. There's an inedible turkey tail, and let's avoid the destroying angel over there. And then the chance turn of a leaf, and before there was nothing but the rich hummus of underbrush, and now the ground is littered with the flame-red wrinkles of cinnamon chanterelles. Reflecting on this dynamic, Cage said, "Ideas are to be found the same way you find wild mushrooms in the forest, just by looking." The chance encounter of a mushroom is similar to the discovery of an unusual sound. He wrote, "A mushroom grows for such a short time, and if you happen to come across it when it's fresh, it's like coming across a sound which is also living only for a short time." Cage believed we are surrounded by beauty, writing beauty is underfoot wherever we take the trouble to look. In this attitude, I find echoes of the first source of our Unitarian Universalist Association, direct experience of transcending mystery and wonder. Cage's work challenges us to directly experience the world. It is not to be mediated through interpretation or explanation. It is just to be experienced. Openness leads to constant wonder. If this view has a limitation, it is ironically for a Buddhist that it does not offer an adequate approach to suffering. Throughout his work, Cage never seems to seriously wrestle with the subject, instead focusing on the possibility of beauty. And I'm not so certain we should find all things beautiful. Torture, pain, the degradation of the environment, war, liking or disliking these things are not a matter of aesthetics, but a matter of ethics. While there might be moments of beauty found within them, the iridescent whirls of oil on water, the chance arrangements of destruction, it is probably best not to view them as beautiful. Doing so might lead us to complacency or acceptance. In the face of the world's problems, inaction is not a moral option. Art only pushes life so far. It might be provocative to write, as Cage did, when the mystic Sri Ramakrishna was asked why, if God is good, is there evil in the world? He replied, "To thicken the plot." But it does little to inspire people to action. It's no doubt that my own rooting in a religious tradition which has as the objective, as we sometimes say, to build the world we dream about, is why I find limitations in Cage here. He does not point the path to such a world. In some of his writings, he envisions an anarchist utopian society where work has been abolished and people respect the planet, but he never offers us any suggestions on how we might create such a society. Such, though, was not his purpose. Instead, Cage offers us the invitation to experience the world as a blessing. Surely, that is the first step towards wholeness. He suggests that each movement we make is part of a dance, each breath the catch of a song, each object a thing of beauty. If we find beauty in the world, how can we do anything but cherish it? As Cage said, every day is a beautiful day. Every day is a beautiful day. So that it might be so, I invite the congregation to say, Amen.
So as you are learning, Cage believed in breaking down barriers between sound and silence, between composer and performer, and between performer and audience. So some of you in the congregation will become part of this performance. You who have black boxes, please open them and take a look right now. When your number comes up, you will be called upon to join this performance. In the aria, which was composed in 1958, Cage drew 9 visual colors plus a dotted black line. The singers must find different colors in their voices to correspond to the 10 visual colors and remain consistent throughout the performance. Dr. Rock and I will each take 5 of the colors to sing. For red, I'll be making a contralto sound. For the dotted black line, I'll do some speech, sing-songy stuff. The light green will be an early Joan Baez sound,